Leading our discussion today is Nick Loris. Mr. Loris is our Herbert and Joyce Morgan Research Fellow in the Thomas A. Rowe Institute for Economic Policy Studies. As an economist, he focuses on energy, environmental and regulatory issues, the economic effects of environmental policies and regulations, climate change, energy efficiency, and subsidies. He also looks at the benefits of free market environmentalism. Before joining us here in 2007, he was an associate at the Charles G. Koch Charitable Foundation. He has also served as an editorial intern at the townhall.com site. Please join me in welcoming Nick Loris. Nick?
Thank you, John. Thank you all for being here. I apologize for the late start. A few technical glitches with our PowerPoints. Must be a grid resilience or reliability issue at hand. But I'm going to pass off my responsibilities to our co-hosts. We're excited to have the Institute for Energy Research co-hosting this event with us today. And so I'm going to invite Kenny Stein, the Director of Policy for IER, to make a few opening remarks and introduce the speakers. Kenny?
Thanks, Nick. Like you said, Kenny Stein from the Institute for Energy Research. Just want to introduce our topic and give it a little background. Most of the people in the room probably have been following this, but for anyone who's new or just maybe at the other event who's stopping by. So the Department of Energy at the end of September released a notice of proposed rulemaking that they described as a grid resiliency pricing rule. And the actual proposal itself was a little vague, but the core proposal was that power plants that have a 90-day fuel supply on site should be guaranteed recovery costs. Now these, obviously the way that's phrased, 90 days on site, that's mainly focused at coal and nuclear, possibly hydropower, but obviously coal and nuclear were the main target. Now the DOE did this under a special section of the law that requires FERC to take some sort of action on this proposed rulemaking. FERC does not have to accept the proposal as written. They are an independent agency and they can make changes as they see fit, but they do have to take some sort of action. So the FERC on October 10th published in the Federal Register a request for information for this decision-making process. And they're planning to take, in that proposal, they have said that they will take final action on December 11th or thereabouts. The exact time is not quite clear, but they have indicated that they do want to keep to the 60-day timeline that the Department of Energy asked for a decision. So because of the way the proposal was set out, favoring coal, nuclear, and possibly hydro, it's created an interesting division of who's on what side of the issue. Obviously, coal and nuclear, some of the utilities that are heavily invested in those areas are very supportive. Then on the other side, you have renewables companies and renewable generators. You also have the natural gas companies, both the producers and the generators, which in the past have normally tend to be on the same side as coal, but on this issue, it's created an interesting split that has separated that long-standing alliance. So at the Institute for Energy Research, we straddle the divide here a little bit. We're not 100% on either side, but as a free market organization, the actual subsidy structure of the proposed rule is simply unacceptable. We obviously oppose it. We opposed it in our comments. But the retirements, the increasingly common retirements of coal and nuclear plants is a real issue. And it's at least in part that we believe that is caused by the subsidies and mandates that favor renewables, their favorable access to the grid, some of these state-level RPSs. So we think it's important that FERC does introduce some of these resiliency, reliability issues into the discussion. Now, how you exactly do that probably needs to be a longer-term discussion, but we are definitely supportive of that, the thrust of the proposal. But ultimately, the answer to government distortions can't be to introduce new distortions that just favor different companies. It just doesn't work that way. So we're very interested to hear the discussion from our guests about this issue. It's obviously an ongoing issue. First, we have Richard Mraz. Hopefully I said that correctly. He's the president of the New Jersey Board of Public Utilities. He was named by Governor Chris Christie as the president of the New Jersey Board of Utilities on October 6, 2014. He is the chairman of the Critical Infrastructure Committee for the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners. He also serves as a member of the Electricity Committee. He's the voting member representing New Jersey to the Organization of PJM States, the official representative organization designed to interact with the Regional Transmission Organization. Our second speaker is Craig Glazer, Vice President of Federal Government Policy for PJM. He coordinates all of PJM's regulatory and legislative policies before Congress, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, the United States Department of Energy, and other federal agencies. Prior to coming to PJM, Mr. Glazer served as Commissioner and Chairman of the Public Utilities Commission of Ohio. Mr. Glazer frequently testifies before Congress and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission on development of regional transmission organizations and the needs of the marketplace. Our final guest is David Hill, Executive Vice President and General Counsel of NRG. It's a position he's held since September 2012. He was responsible for all the company's legal, regulatory, environmental, and governmental affairs, activities, and personnel. Prior to joining NRG, David was a partner and co-head of the energy practice at Sidley Austin LLP in Washington, D.C. From 2005 to 2009, he served as General Counsel of the United States Department of Energy, and from 2002 to 2005, he was DOE's General Counsel for Energy Policy. Please welcome our guests, and we'll turn over to Nick for the Q&A. Thank you.
Kenny, thank you for the introduction. Nick, thank you. And I want to thank both IER and Heritage for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here to talk about these issues, which I have had the opportunity, or some say the dubious responsibility to have to deal with as the president of the New Jersey board, but also in the couple of the responsibilities that Kenny mentioned as our voting representative to the Organization of PJM States, and then on a national level through NARUC to deal with these issues in and around baseload generation. So let me do three things. Let me just talk to you for a few minutes about New Jersey's perspective on these issues, and particularly though the events or issues that have informed my position, particularly as the president of the board. Also talk to you for a few minutes then about the state's public policy position on these issues and what we have already filed in terms of our official positions. And then lastly, to address for a few moments some of the challenges that come with the proposals that are already made, the NOPR particularly, and the work that FERC has to undertake now, and that policymakers here in Washington will need to, along with other stakeholders, need to address. So first, let me just give you the perspective that informs my approach to these issues, the first of which is that as the president of the board, I'm also effectively the chief energy officer for the state of New Jersey, so we have the policymaking responsibility on energy issues as much as the fact that we are the regulator of the utility companies. However, in New Jersey, we are a deregulated state, so we regulate the distribution companies and not generation. So going back 20 years ago, in the 1990s, New Jersey was one of the states, of course, in the Northeast that did deregulate. I have some also professional history with that, having served as the chief counsel to the governor, who was Christy Whitman at the time. When she signed the deregulation bill, I was there. So I know some of that history, and here I am 20 years ago having to deal now with the continuing circumstances around deregulation. New Jersey has a diverse energy mix. We do have, as part of our generation portfolio in New Jersey, 45% comes from nuclear generation. About 45% comes largely from natural gas-fired generation. The rest is a mix, very small amount of coal generation, and then renewables. Our support in New Jersey has been articulated from administration to administration to support the continuation of effectively that mix of generation I just mentioned, and particularly our nuclear units in our state. They are a critical component of reliable generation of electricity, not just to New Jersey, but the benefit should be noted does in fact flow literally to other states, including Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Delaware, and beyond within the PJM grid. Now, in New Jersey, over the last couple of years, I've spent a lot of time both observing and having dialogue with my colleagues in other states, New York and Ohio and Illinois, Pennsylvania, Maryland, where the pressures, the financial pressures on generating units has been coming, and where in some of those states, as most of you know, has been addressed by a series of proposals or actions that were taken either in regulatory actions or in legislation. Those are driven largely by the same sets of concerns that I have, that we have in New Jersey, which is that with these baseload generation assets and having a diverse generation portfolio, for a variety of reasons, which I'll mention in just a moment, it is valuable to continue to have them to operate. The concerns that come with the loss of any of those larger portfolios of generation, and in New Jersey, admittedly, we are concerned about the potential loss of the nuclear generation portfolio, comes from several perspectives. The one, which can't be ignored, is the fact that they themselves are large employers in the state. So as a practical matter, a political practical matter, there are many forces that would want to support their continued operation. But I look at this from a reliability perspective. I look at it because of the effects of a series of other events of which I look to the future and I'm concerned about. The first of which is if there is the loss of large components of the generation mix, so in New Jersey, the loss of the nuclear units, which would not likely be replaced, if we are to rely on natural gas, our concern is that there would be an over-reliance in natural gas, which at some point in the future could either be interrupted or there could be in the future price volatility, which then impacts the consumers as well as generation prices. One other particular event from a resiliency perspective has affected my decisions on these and my perspectives, and that comes with a concern about the potential supply. And one event in particular, which was in the late summer of last year, New Jersey, because of a disruption in natural gas supply that came through Pennsylvania, did in fact face the potential curtailment of a significant portion of its gas supply into New Jersey. And if we had been during this pipeline disruption, which did occur in Pennsylvania, which feeds New Jersey, where gas supplies were otherwise reduced to approximately half of the normal flow of natural gas into the state, which is for residential as well as commercial customers, would otherwise affect interruptible supply contracts to generation, we could have had significant outages and curtailment of electric generation in New Jersey. In and of itself, this kind of reliability or resilience factor is something that has informed my decision-making on these issues and my positions. So as a result, I do believe that there needs to be a valuation of these attributes that currently the market does not provide. So our position in New Jersey is that we support the continuation of the markets that drive the generation industry. And that is, as I said, that's something that we charted 20 years ago. But I do believe that that has been sought by many interests, including state regulators like myself, that heretofore, prior to this administration here in Washington, there had not been a clear articulation of federal policy on these issues. And to that extent, it was left to states, often when these generation assets were under pressure, to take action unilaterally. And therefore, the legislation that we saw in Ohio and Illinois, which was adopted, the actions in New York, which were admittedly for other policy drivers as well. But this issue in and around the need for resilience, the need to consider the fact that we should have this diverse portfolio of generation, whether it be nuclear, natural gas, and coal, and look at the concentration of those is very important to maintaining that resiliency. And to that extent, I have therefore been one of probably just a handful of state regulators that have been supportive of a market approach to valuing these various attributes. And to that extent, back in the spring of last year, I testified at the first technical conference at FERC, and I said very explicitly that it was incumbent upon the federal regulators to consider a market construct that would value these attributes. I was outnumbered by a number of the other attendees that day that suggested there should be other attributes, but nevertheless, I do believe, because of our experiences in New Jersey, that these reliability and resiliency attributes can and should be valued into a market construct, lest, as I say, the states are left to unilateral action to support those units. So we have participated in the technical conferences of FERC. We have made filings. We have on the NOPR filed as well in support of the goals of the NOPR, which are to effectuate some market construct that does include a valuation mechanism for these various attributes. So I do support it. That has been our position at the BPU and that of the state of New Jersey. However, there are continuing challenges and some late-breaking developments from my state, which is that there have been calls for state action in New Jersey. Our governor and our legislature have not specifically spoken to this issue as to whether they would support some other means, including state legislation. And I will let you know, those of you that follow this explicitly, that on Monday of this coming week, the legislature will have, the Assembly and the Senate will hold a joint committee of their environment and energy committees to explore further this issue. So I think it is probably safe to say, and though I can't predict, that the legislature will, over the next several weeks, take up this action, any potential action more particularly. But let me just wrap up by telling you, mentioning a few issues that I still believe and I still would support actions by the FERC and federal regulators and federal policymakers to continue to support the goals of the NOPR, to continue to look for a market solution that does value the attributes that I mentioned, to try and better value the entirety of the generation mix. It's also worth pointing out that I went back and have talked to a number of regulators and policymakers that were around 20 years ago when deregulation was occurring. And at the time, the Northeast regulators largely were focused only on economics and marginal cost of the delivery of electricity. They did not, and specifically did not, value other reliability aspects. And I am told by a number of those that were around 20 years, or at least I was reminded, because I actually do recall this now, that many of the other states that did not deregulate, those that stayed in a fully integrated, regulated environment, particularly in the South and moving west in this country, did so because they did say to others that the markets that were being constructed did not fully value all of the attributes that were necessary to keep the lights on. And I was reminded of this just recently, that that was a very explicit conversation had by a number of regulators. Let me wrap up by just mentioning a few of the challenges. Even though I support the goals, as I said, of the NOPR, the work that FERC hopefully could do, because it does provide the impetus to look for a solution. It encourages, and I'm encouraged, by the way, by proposals like those that PJM has put forward to look for additional ways that the market can value attributes in generation. But the challenges include having very clear policy direction at the federal level from a macro level, clear regulatory policy articulated at the implementation level at the agencies such as at FERC, probably a collective consensus among states like those in PJM which is very difficult, and then valuing resiliency, which is a very difficult process, but if we put our minds to it, I believe it can be done, and actually putting the valuation and the dollars to what those attributes are, including a valuation in and around some aspect of resiliency, because I believe that there is something to the fact that we look at it from a national security perspective, and also a consideration of exactly what is this acceptable level of fuel concentration and the risk analysis around those metrics. Environmental attributes as well should be included, as well as the economics of all of these attributes in a diverse portfolio. So once again, thank you for having me. Look forward to any other questions.
Greg? Yeah, please go for it.
All right, thank you. All right, thank you. I need to actually do something a little bit different because I need to start with a public service announcement. While I was sitting here, I got a text from the DC Police Department, real text, indicating that if anybody drove here, they need to move their vehicle off the street. Turns out, apparently, the Army Corps of Engineers is on its way into DC to finally drain the swamp. I've also been told that President Trump this morning waived the requirement for environmental impact statements, so we are in full mode of draining the swamp. And frankly, my goal here is to make sure competitive markets don't go down the drain as part of this effort to drain the swamp. So that's a little bit of what I'm here to talk about today. And I had some great slides that we'll have to shadow box because you won't have them. But let me just sort of take you through. We could talk a lot about what's wrong with the DOE proposal, and I do want to touch on some things that are wrong with it, but I want to start out on a positive note what's right about, because I think DOE, particularly in the August report that they issued, but even carrying through some of those themes in the NOPR, got a number of things right. One is the August report, and then the NOPR itself did highlight the need for price formation reforms, particularly in certain regions. And price formation, like resilience, has become a new buzzword. Like everybody, Washington's great because people come up with a word and everybody jumps on it. But actually, the price formation efforts at FERC that have happened have been helpful, but you get in this old yin-yang that since I've been in this business, what do you do regionally and what do you do nationally? And because the price formation efforts started out on a national scale, there were immediate limitations on what the FERC staff could come up with. And so price formation in many cases has devolved into fights about allocation of uplift between day ahead and real time, which is sort of like fighting between the allocation of the cost of this pen between the button on the top and the clip. You could fight about it all day, but I'm not sure it really matters to the operation of the pen. So we've sort of lost our way a little bit on price formation because of the minutia that we've gotten into. And I think the DOE appropriately pulled back and said, you need to look at this as a bigger scale. So I think that's one thing they got right. I also think they appropriately focused on this issue of dependence on the pipelines. But the interesting part about that is if you actually dig into this issue, there is a NERC standard that addresses this subject. But if you dust it off in the arcane world of NERC, it's the TPL standard. If you actually read it, there ain't a lot to it. You're supposed to do analyses and studies. You're supposed to have a plan around those studies. There's no direction on a national standard, which is what Congress asked for, in how pipeline contingencies are measured across the nation, whether there's some consistency in them, what do you actually do if you identify them? Again, this is the reliability agency that Congress has established, and yet the standard itself, quite frankly, is very weak. So that doesn't help matters either in terms of this, and I think DOE appropriately focused on that. They also, particularly in the August report, and they varied a lot on this in the more recent NOPR, the need for a fuel-neutral approach to resilience issues. We can talk about pipeline resilience issues, and they exist, But I could also talk about nuclear resilience issues, loss of nuclear plants. I'm old enough to remember the locks freezing on the Ohio River affecting coal deliveries and the UMW strikes. And so resilience is not an issue that one fuel is resilient and the others aren't. I think we've gotten in this very polarized debate when in fact it is a much larger, and each fuel has some warts to it in that respect. But I think that was, the focus on fuel neutral was appropriate. The changing the resource mix requires new tools, I think, was also a good one. So that's what they got right. Let's talk a little bit about what they didn't get right in our view. One is, quite frankly, to be honest about it, we view that the cure that they proposed is worse than the disease. Because the disease is significant, but the cure of a cost of service fix to all power plants that are coal and nuclear that have a 90-day fuel supply really is a very sort of imprecise, at best, remedy to the problem. If I've got resilience issues, they in many cases are more locational issues, and a power plant in Ohio is not going to necessarily solve a problem in New Jersey. A 90-day coal supply sitting in one part of the system is not necessarily going to help the another part of the system. It was kind of a very sort of sledgehammer type remedy that we raised concerns with. We also think it's, as was mentioned before, we are here about competition. We are here about eliminating subsidies. We're here about not creating new ones and further distorting the market. So we think also that's another example where sort of cure worsened the disease. And we think it actually is going to frustrate new investment. Because yes, while we're retaining these investments, but we also need the investment community to be putting money into new investment of all kinds, be it from small nuclear to batteries to natural gas facilities. I fear that they're going to be frozen. If I was an investor, I would freeze if I knew that one entity has this guaranteed payment going forward. And you could call it interim, but I've been in Washington long enough. I've never seen anything interim that ever goes away, so that's another issue. And quite frankly, there is some concern from a PJM perspective that we feel like we got a target on our back because this NOPR was written about RTOs with capacity markets, and then further RTOs with capacity markets with coal and nuclear, and those are the ones we have to focus on. But if you actually look at this diversity question, and we put this in our comments, we actually have a very diverse fleet. Do we need to maintain it? Absolutely. Is that important? Yes. But in terms of dependency on natural gas, Texas, Florida, the Southeast, and New England all are significantly more dependent on natural gas and natural gas pipeline system than is PJM region. These are the numbers. Yet, unfortunately, the NOPR has been narrowed, a legitimate issue, but it's been narrowed only to RTOs with capacity markets with coal and nuclear. When in fact, if we're going to have this discussion about resilience, which we should have, and the threats to the pipeline system, let's talk about Florida, let's talk about the Southeast, let's talk about New England, let's talk about Texas, each of which have a much greater dependence. So what we put forward to FERC was an alternative approach. One is, and I can't do this justice even with the slides, but definitely without the slides, but we have an energy price formation proposal to address some of these issues. We think there is actually price suppression going on, and it gets into the weeds of how when we let inflexible units, which could be coal, could be nuclear, could be gas, when we let them set clearing prices and when we don't. I had a great slide on this, but I don't have it. I'll leave it for questions. And we've asked for a deadline. Give us some process discipline. We'd like to come forward with this proposal. But this is an example in the yin-yang of national versus regional. This price formation proposal is really very specific to PJM. New England says it doesn't apply to them, and they probably have some truth to that. New York, et cetera. This is a very specific PJM proposal. We're ready to do it. We think it's better than an interim solution. We're asking FERC strictly for a process deadline. I hope they're responsive to that. The second, though, on the larger resilience issue, as I mentioned, this is both a regional and national issue. As I mentioned, we've got greater dependency on natural gas pipelines in the Southeast and others. And there are some threats that are common to everyone. Cyber threats, physical attack threats, terrorism threats, et cetera. I'm old enough to remember the days when we used to fight about gold plating. And so, we can order lots of workarounds. I can double the strength of the transmission system. My planners would love to do that tomorrow. But at some point, somebody's going to say, you're gold plating the system. And where is the sweet spot between what's appropriate resilience and what's gold plating? President Moroz knows how difficult it is in a siting case when people say you don't need it. Well, what do I need it for? Do I need it for a 1 in 10 event, a 1 in 100-year event, a 1 in 1,000-year event? Who makes those decisions? There's a big who decides issue with regard to that policy question of how safe is safe. What level of resilience? We need some policy direction, and we asked for that would be a fruitful subject for further discussion. So, bottom line, as a path forward, we are requesting, let's not spend time on this interim relief question, and I could talk more about that. That will become its own. That will take all the oxygen out of the room. We'll never get to the actual solutions longer term. Price formation, we think this will be helpful. Is it a silver bullet for every nuclear and coal unit? No, it's not designed to be. But will it help ensure and help address the negative pricing issue associated with the production tax credit? It definitely will help in that area. And engage stakeholders in a larger discussion on resilience. That's kind of our ask. We'll see what they do on December 11th, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much, and thanks to Heritage for having me here today. So, first of all, NRG. So, just to be clear at the point at which I'm coming at this. So, NRG, what business are we in? We generate power. We have all kinds of generation. We're one of the largest coal consumers in the country. We have natural gas capacity. We're one of the largest solar generators. We're one of the largest wind generators, and we own 44% of a nuclear power plant. So we're not against or for any particular kind of generation. We've got all of it. We also have about 3 million retail customers. So it's not as if we're unconcerned with the end cost of energy. All of those consumers are in areas where there is retail competition. All of them have the ability to hire us. All of them have the ability to fire us. None of them are stuck with us as a supplier. And as a result, what are we, and I should also add, we are in the business, it's amazing to me how many folks have opinions about all this, but they're not actually in the business of allocating at-risk capital. We are in the business of trying to attract capital, at-risk capital. We have to sell our business plans to our investors. We have to sell our business plans to the banks who actually will lend money or not, and at rates that that actually allow the financing of a project. So it is from those perspectives that I come at any of these things. It is not from the perspective of how can we be a better rent seeker than the other guy, or how is it that I can fob off my stupid mistakes to people who are stuck paying for the decisions that I make, because all of them in the competitive markets can get rid of you. So what is it that I think ought to be done by this? So given I can make really quick work of the DOE NOPR. Do we think there is a problem? Yes, we think there's a problem. We think it's not exactly the same problem that DOE identified, but we think there are very significant problems with the wholesale markets in the United States. Do I think it is the solution that DOE proposed? No, it's absolutely not the solution that DOE proposed. If there is of all of the problems with the wholesale energy markets and the retail markets for that matter, the combating subsidies, let's see who can out-subsidize the other one. the only reason that the American consumers aren't completely apoplectic about this is that they actually, that the price of energy is generally pretty low right now, and there are other snakes closer to the boot for them in terms of what they're worried about. You want my opinion about it? Now, but what is the answer? I mean, I think there are major problems out there, and what should be done about them. Now, the commenters on the DOE NOPR, I think it's amazing to me how many people were congratulating themselves in their comments on the DOE NOPR, talking about how great their comments were when they did nothing but criticize it. You know, my favorite quote, and that actually is true of the vast majority of the comments that were filed. That's not actually heavy lifting. I mean, I think my favorite quote, as all my colleagues at NRG would know, is a quote by Henry Ford, who said, I'm slightly paraphrasing, but thinking is the hardest work in the world, which is the probable reason so few people do it. And I think that, you know, talking about an idea that, to me, in terms of the solution, is on its face bad. Okay, you know, so what's the actual, what's the answer? I'll get around to that in a minute, because, you know, and actually, I don't have, of course, don't have the slides. Go to the NRG website. You'll find our comments there. NRG.com. Go to the about the company tab. Go to the energy policy tab. The comments are there. And we go into great detail about what our solutions are. But even apart from the DOE NOPR, what is more fundamentally the actual issue in the electricity business today? I mean, I think for some of you who live in the electricity world know this, but some who don't may not recognize this. The Federal Power Act, when was that enacted? Well, the answer is 1935. I mean, we have a structure of the electricity industry of the United States that is a product of the New Deal, and how it cuts the jurisdiction between the states and the feds, how the system is set up. And of course, we're stuck with a system where part of it's regulated over at FERC, parts at the states. You got the EPA that is overdoing their thing. And so what have we got? Well, you know, what you wind up with here in the electricity business, and this is actually what you see going on at FERC right now, and what you see evidence with the NOPR, is the overall fundamental problem, and people are trying to actually get at sort of the results in this in different ways. But it comes down to the idea of competition. What should be, you know, people lose sight of the fact of what should be the organizing principle for what we are doing in the electricity business. And again, I'll just keep my remarks to the economic regulatory area of FERC, and FERC jurisdiction under the Federal Power Act, and for that matter, the involvement of the states in regulating electricity, and leave aside the EPA, although I will be very happy to talk about that if anybody wants to talk about that. But the fundamental thing of what we have going on at FERC right now is people have lost track of the fact that the actual answer, the actual organizing principle should be competition, should be competitive markets. Forget about all this other stuff, all the rent seeking, all the details. I mean, the details will be important, but what is actually what is the actual lodestar organizing principle that should be the policy? And I actually, one of the slides you will see in the deck, and the deck will be available at the website if it isn't already, and I'm sure it'll be available on the Heritage website too. The markets have fallen behind in terms of addressing a lot of the things that have happened in the electricity business, whether that's more renewables, more demand response, more controllable demand, changes in natural gas prices dropping like a rock. And the market rules have been slow to respond. And instead, what we now have are a lot of the politicians and regulators trying to micromanage the results of markets. And, you know, one of the core principles in antitrust law is to protect competition, not competitors. And yet, what is it we have going on so much of the time right now? It's the effort to try to protect the competitors. It's worrying about, well, do we have what do we think about the impacts of these jobs over here? Look, we're a company that has 8,000 or 10,000 employees. It's not like we're unconcerned with employees. We're worried about our employees and creating jobs every single day. But what is it that overall is in the best interests of the American consumer, that is the economic engine of the United States, that actually promotes efficient allocation of capital and is the best way to protect consumers and allow them to actually exercise their own individual choices and exercise their own liberty? The answer is competition. And by the way, I'm not talking about, some of my friends in the monopoly, the Soviet-style world will say, well, it's we're talking about the difference between regulation and deregulation. No, that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is the difference between regulated competition and monopoly. That's actually what we're talking about. Would you say that you have deregulation or regulation in the cell phone business? Well, you can choose your cell phone. There is absolutely competition there. But it's not, it's regulated competition. Obviously, there's regulation in that world. So I think we're, some of the time we get lost in the debate about some of the and people lose track about what the organizing principle is. You'll see a chart on the slides that talk about there are a lot of the benefits of competition and of lower prices in wholesale power markets that are not reaching retail consumers. And you'll see the chart in there right with the data that talks about the price that retail consumers are paying as opposed to what's been happening on the wholesale power prices. Wholesale power prices have dropped like a rock, along with the price of the price of natural gas, and of course the price of renewables have come down dramatically too. But you will see, what have consumers seen on their bills? Well, they haven't seen that. I mean, now there are reasons for that. And, well, just go to the slides. Now, so actually there's a great, and I love my friends in Georgia, but there is a great apples to apples comparison of what happens when you have a wholesale market with competition and when you have one that doesn't. NRG actually embarked on, and I'll stop here in a minute. I could go on for a little bit about this. NRG actually embarked with a partner in building two new units at our South Texas project, nuclear plant down southeast of Houston, and got the license for that back in 2007. That project was canceled back in 2011, and the company wrote off about $400 million, and the shareholders ate the whole thing. The consumers of Texas, so what did the consumers, and again, I have nothing, we have a nuclear plant. Again, we're for whatever generation actually serves the needs of the customers at the lowest cost. Okay? But we canceled it. Why did we cancel it? Well, it's because in a competitive market, it wasn't going to be competitive. And of course, look at what is happening in the state of Texas today in terms of the economics and the job growth and the state of Texas. There are lots of reasons for that, but the state, we canceled it, so we didn't build the 2 units. Well, of course, in the state of Georgia, I mean, it is getting built, and at the cost of I think $16 billion and counting. And of course, there isn't anything about buying natural gas in other parts of the country. We just buy gas on the open market. We don't have any more favorable way of we don't produce gas. We don't have any more favorable way of getting gas or fuel supply than anybody else out there. But there's a result you get in competitive markets, and there's a result you get with monopoly. I will say that just as talking to an audience, and I mean, please look forward to your questions, or I'm very happy to talk about after this. But I think one of the fundamental problems from the conservative side having to do with energy policy and electricity policy is conservatives, and again, I served in the Bush administration. I come from the right side of the Republican side of things. The conservatives haven't actually decided what their organizing principle is. I will tell you, I think the left knows what their principle is. It's climate change. And I think that so much of that goes back, and again, we can all, you can tell me if you think I'm wrong. Well, you actually can have your own opinion about that, as to whether or not I'm right or wrong about that. But you know, when it comes to conservative energy policy, what is the organizing principle? What is it? I mean, is it energy dominance? Is it reliability and resiliency? Is it competition? Is it national security? Is it affordability? Is it coal jobs? Is it opposition to the Clean Power Plan? Every single one of the things I just mentioned has been stated as a primary objective of something having to do with things on as conservatives or on the right, having to do with electricity policy. So what's the fundamental organizing principle? To me, they're focusing on competition, competitive markets should be the organizing principle. And with respect to the DOE NOPR, just to bring it back to that, it's not like there aren't already things pending at FERC that FERC can act on right now, that there is a developed record on right now, some of which have been sitting at the commission for 3 or 4 years, that would do, that would have a dramatic, and I can give you the docket numbers. If any of you want them, I can give them to you, that have been sitting there. There are things on remand from the DC Circuit. FERC has in front of it actions that would actually help protect the competitive markets and would actually help protect, just by coincidence, the economics of a lot of the plants that the DOE NOPR is intended to benefit. And FERC just needs to actually, rather than trying to completely reinvent the wheel, it needs to actually act on dockets that are sitting before it right now. There you go. Thank you.
All right, we're running up on time, but let's open it up to questions. If you have one, please raise your hand and wait for the mic so we can catch it on the live stream. We'll start back here.
Yeah, so I guess what I would sort of, yeah, I'm Lou Pularisi, Energy Policy Research Foundation. One of the things that's missing with these discussion is, okay, what, if consumers want low-cost power and a very low probability of dropping load, what does a competitive market look like that delivers that? And I actually think that's a pretty important question. I mean, what is the mix? How would you see in a stylized format? How would you describe that market? Because I think that's really kind of what Secretary Perry was getting at in a kind of ham-handed way.
I'll just comment that I think it's Craig Glazer. I'll comment that I think we have that market in the sense that we have a NERC criteria. We can argue about it. We have a 1 day in 10-year loss of load probability. Can argue whether that's too much, not enough. It's only a probabilistic model. It doesn't mean load. And we have a competitive market model to meet that standard. We can argue and maybe need to have a national discussion whether that's the appropriate standard. I actually think the answer to that is there shouldn't be one standard for the whole country or even for different consumers, because if I'm a data center, my 1 day in 10 years is not acceptable, while me in my house, it might be. I might not be willing to pay more, but unfortunately, this industry has come up with a national standard, and we build to that national standard. So I don't think the model is broken, but I think some more interesting work on should we all be building to this magical 1 day in 10 years and saying that's what everybody needs and that's it is an important question.
Let me just jump in there. I would agree. And there have been discussions about the possibility of having sub-regions, of almost creating sub-markets for different reliability aspect or resiliency aspects. That's actually been an ongoing discussion in and around PJM particularly.
You know, one thing I would just say about that, when I think ERCOT, which actually does a great job of managing both. And again, I realize we're talking about a single state and so forth, but in ERCOT, managing a really fully competitive wholesale market and a fully competitive retail market does a great job of that. One of the things about when we talk about resiliency and reliability, and one thing I think it is sometimes useful to come back to, what do consumers actually want and what would they be willing to pay for it? Electricity consumers are never asked that. You know, when there's an outage, I'm sure President Moroz hears immediately from everybody that he gets calls immediately about the outage. But what is one of the reasons he gets those calls? Because consumers don't actually know what they're paying for reliability. They don't know what the actual cost is. I'll tell you, wholesale consumers, what do they buy on the gas side? You all know. A lot of them buy interruptible gas. Why is that? Well, because interruptible gas transportation is a whole lot cheaper, dramatically cheaper than firm. And most of the time, they know they're not going to be interrupted. And of course, if they are interrupted, well, I guess they deal. But what would consumers on electricity, what would they actually say if they actually knew what reliability cost them? What would they choose? Here's the answer. We don't actually really know that answer, do we? Not really. What other product do you buy where you don't know in advance what it costs? You don't know how much you're using, and you find out what you're going to pay for it after you get the bill. I don't know. I'd love it if that actually worked with cars. I'd just go pick out one, and actually, I probably wouldn't like it, because you find out, you overpaid. But there's so much that on the retail side. One of the things that we're really trying to very strongly advocate for at NRG is more retail competition, because more consumer actual empowerment to be able to make their own decisions about what they actually are willing to pay for, and having more visibility to what it actually costs them, we think is good for consumers.
Question back there.
Birchall Wilson, I'm an Australian economist. I worked at an energy company in Melbourne, and we did actually, as part of the regulation of that energy business, we did have a service incentive reliability mechanism that attempted to price and incorporate into the cost of service the value of reliability. So is there scope within the regulatory scheme in the states to look at those issues?
I think that's the very issue. And I think that there is now an emerging, at least amongst, I will tell you, in my perspective, I think an emerging recognition that we should be doing that we should be putting that value. And that's the effort that I've said that FERC should do. It's some of the work, good amount of the work that PJM is undertaking. And I will point out that it is exactly the conceptual mechanism that a company like NRG has suggested in its NOPR filing, that there be a reliability or resiliency valuation that's incorporated. So yes, I think that we need to do that. The question, as I said earlier, is exactly what is that valuation? And that is a very difficult consideration. But I give credit to a company like NRG for actually putting forward that kind of proposal in this process.
As President Moroz says, and you'll see this in our comments, I mean, what it was we said is if the regulators decided they wanted to value resiliency, the way to actually do it is with a forward resiliency market that is fuel neutral and that is attribute based. And the idea of picking out which plant, you look at what has happened with respect to the nuclear bailouts in New York and Illinois. I mean, they were for one reason until they saw a different pathway with a particular paragraph in the Supreme Court opinion, and then they changed their whole tune, and then they got after that. And so I think and then there was the PJM analysis relating to the situation there in Illinois with the nukes there. I think the idea that the effort to save this plant versus that plant, I mean, if you want to value resiliency, reliability, create a forward resiliency market, decide the attributes, allow the market to price it on a fuel neutral basis.
By the way, I should point out that at least in PJM, the market monitor, who, by the way, a very well-respected economist, has said, let's do that. Tell me what the rules of the market are and live by them. And if it includes specific attributes and valuation on resiliency, so be it. I mean, he's even suggested a particular mechanism, which there's great debate and disagreement about whether that is the right mechanism. But even the market monitor and PJM has suggested that that is something that can and could be embraced.
I just want to go back to, and David raised a point about history. I'm sort of a student of history, so I always like to talk about that. One of the reasons, why do we have a 1 day and 10-year standard, single standard? It's because back in 1935, what were people focused on was universal service, getting this product available to everyone. And the whole rate-making system is based on averaging cost. It's averaging cost, but it was done for a legitimate policy reason, which is electricity is a public good. We want it all through the country. We don't want somebody at the end of the line paying an excessive amount. We don't want people in one state paying greatly more than others. So we're going to have peanut butter. We're going to average everything around. That was the system. And so reliability then sort of followed that and said, well, since we're averaging this, everybody should have the same level. It may be time to look at that again, but we need to understand why we did what we did before we go and change it. And sometimes we rush to change things, and we don't take time to look at what were our predecessors thinking about? What were they trying to accomplish? Is it still legitimate or not? I think it's a worthwhile discussion, but I worry sometimes we just throw it away before we think about it. Nothing is a free lunch. There will be winners and losers. There will be issues with that. I think we need to think that through. How do we maintain some degree of universal service? And I'm not just talking about low-income support. I'm talking about geographic support around the country while still getting to a more market-based system of valuing reliability. That's a tough one, but I hope FERC, there's a lot of good stuff they could do in the next couple months and years to engage the industry on those topics. And we really haven't engaged in those topics in a very long time.
Hey, Nick, I'm sorry. And of course, we've got a million things to say. One thing President Rose mentioned earlier, or maybe Craig mentioned it, and I do want to make sure that I mention this. There's been some discussion over at FERC about an interim final rule. That would be a disaster. I mean, I think again, from the perspective of companies that have to allocate at-risk capital and have to make investments and have to try to figure out what the market rules, the idea of putting in place an interim final rule that is what DOE proposed, and with whatever the permanents are of things, things can have a long life once they are put in place on an interim basis. Would be a bad outcome. I mean, we are absolutely outright opposed to the idea of some interim final rule coming out of FERC on this thing.
We'll do one last question right up front.
For the unfamiliar, like the DOE and NOPR selects 90 days of fuel on site as being the attribute that it wants to reward. And all of you mentioned attributes that we might put prices on in some sort of reliability market. For those of us who don't know much about it, could you just offer a couple examples of what those may be for particular generating stations when what we really want is system reliability?
Go read our comments. But the ability to respond. Just to take one step back, the whole deal about 90. Again, we have plants that burn massive amounts of coal. One of which is the Parrish plant southeast of Houston. Now, what happened in the context of all of the hurricane? Well, here's what happened. The coal pile, and this is a massive coal pile, just so you know, burns PRB coal, takes unit trains of PRB coal from Wyoming. Massive pile of coal. The coal got so wet with the rain that we're basically almost putting sludge into the unit. We had to switch it to natural gas. One of the units was switched over to natural gas and ran perfectly. But why was that unit able to respond the way it did? Well, it was because it was dual fueled. We've had, of course, it's possibility that they're in the context of the polar vortex. What were the units we had that were some of the most valuable there? Oil-fired units that had oil in the tank because the natural gas supply was absolutely needed for heating, for home heating. There were constraints on and so it's something where to me, that's a problem of sort of looking at, okay, well, how big should the coal pile be? I mean, look at what the ability to respond in a certain increment, the ability to actually run for a certain number of hours. And again, as I think Craig or as President Moroz were talking about, that it could be something different in different regions too. So I think there is a tailored solution to that, but it is attribute based. It's not trying to figure out, okay, well, we like that fuel or we don't like that fuel.
Yeah, I would just analogize that I was recently to a car dealer. I mean, I go to shop for a car, I look at efficiency, miles per gallon. How does it handle? I don't go and shop for the size of the fuel tank. I don't walk in the dealer and says, I only want a car with a 17-gallon fuel tank. That's what I want to look at. I don't know anybody that's done that. And that's not an attribute in and of itself that has meaning. It's performance. And performance has a lot of different features to it. But I think that is the problem with the DOE NOPR, is it focuses on the size of the fuel tank as opposed to the efficiency of the car.
Just one other example, and I'm not criticizing, being critical of the natural gas industry, but and I think Craig mentioned it, to the extent that natural gas generators have interruptible supply contracts, they are valued at a lower supply value than a firm contract. And if a generator wants to be assured that they're going to have natural gas, regardless of what happens downstream, they got to pay more. That means that the marginal cost of their generation in that unit, if they have a firm contract, is higher than the marginal cost of one that has an interruptible contract. So if you believe from a policy perspective that you need to have that gas no matter what, you have to strike a firm contract. It costs more. That means the marginal cost of that generating unit will be more than another unit.
Thank you, gentlemen, for that discussion. We will make sure that the slides as well as the public comments are available on our website. Please join me in thanking these three guys.
Thank you.